There is a reason why people came up with the saying that lightning doesn't strike the same place twice. This is because there are events or phenomena that are so unlikely, absurd, and cosmically coincidental that, if they occur, one can be sure they will never happen again. The context in which this event occurred, or its reason, will never be the same as at the moment of its emergence. And I believe that one of those moments is the invention, or rather, the accidental creation of gunpowder. Just think. Such a powerful discovery happened from the desire to find the elixir of immortality, one of the most incredible and comically absurd events in history, depending on your sense of humor. I mean, the Chinese were not destined to discover gunpowder. It was a complete coincidence that could have happened to any other civilization at any other time, or perhaps never. I believe there are certain events or discoveries that would inevitably have occurred, even if they happened much later in our timeline, such as the Industrial Revolution. But we are accustomed to having a limited understanding of the technological evolution of civilizations throughout our history, and we believe that it is impossible for an industrialized civilization not to have discovered the idea or concept of firearms using gunpowder. In fact, the discovery of gunpowder in the context of our history and the evolution of civilizations is anecdotal and unnecessary, as we reached it naturally. It was a pure coincidence that had almost no chance of happening. Considering all of the above, what I really wanted to ask in this video was whether this absurd coincidence would have occurred in China during the Tang Dynasty much earlier in our history and in another part of the world. What if Rome had discovered gunpowder? This is an alternative history we will explore today. First of all, I must apologize for the lie I just told. It was not the Romans who discovered gunpowder in this timeline, but the Greeks many centuries before Roman domination. So why isn't the title of this video, "What if the ancient Greeks discovered gunpowder?" Let's be honest for a moment. If I had chosen such a title, the video wouldn't be as appealing. It's the fault of the YouTube algorithm, not mine. So in any case, why did I decide that the ancient Greeks discovered gunpowder, not the Romans? Firstly, if I chose that the Romans really discovered gunpowder, it would have had to happen in a period historically close to their peak. I think we all agree that imagining the Romans discovering gunpowder during the reign of kings or at the beginning of the Republic, before the Gallic invasion, is something too crazy and strange to be an interesting idea. But then you could say that I should have made them open the gunpowder later in their history, after they had already defeated Carthage, or even after the beginning of their imperial period. But that would also be a mistake, and not very interesting. Remember that medieval Europe did not immediately start using firearms at the moment of gunpowder's discovery. It was a centuries-long process of trial and error that led to the creation of firearms used by the Spaniards in the New World when they discovered America, rather than something that happened overnight. On average, it may take 2 to 3 centuries for civilization to reach the technological level necessary to use gunpowder weapons. If I had allowed the Romans of Augustus's time to discover gunpowder, it would have taken them at least 2 or 3 centuries to create prototypes resembling the firearms invented by Europeans in the 14th or 15th century in our history. By that time, the empire would already be in complete decline in all respects and would lack the resources or innovative drive to create new, complex, and advanced weapons for its time. However, this is also not the most plausible scenario. Moreover, let's be honest about what we really want to see: Romans using firearms, not the process that led to it. This brings me to the second point: the lack of creativity. When people analyze the industrial or technological potential of the Romans at their peak, they often confuse creativity, initiative, and innovation. The Romans were quite innovative and capable of taking the initiative in copying, adapting, and improving the technologies, sciences, and knowledge of other cultures with which they interacted or conquered. But they lacked the creativity to allow the boldest ideas to come to the minds of their engineers and other scientists and geniuses of that time. While the Greeks were completely the opposite, they were extremely creative and developed their abstract thinking to a very high level, allowing them to generate the strangest and most original ideas of their time. However, they lacked the drive, interest, and sense of innovation to realize these ideas and their creativity. For this reason, I decided that in this story, the Greeks, during their golden age in the 5th and 4th centuries BC, would accidentally discover gunpowder while experimenting with various substances, explosively and shockingly, just as the Chinese did in our history nearly 1,500 years later. As I mentioned earlier, the Romans, upon encountering this discovery, would continue to explore the properties as well as the technological and military potential of using gunpowder. The Greeks would likely quickly abandon the idea of experimenting with something as dangerous and deadly as this strange substance they discovered. The Greeks would acknowledge the existence of this substance and discuss its formula, functioning, and overall usefulness. But this discovery would be perceived as something strange, comparable to witchcraft, and considered extremely dangerous. Thus, new experiments with it would not be recommended. Later, during the time of Alexander the Great, perhaps in an effort to optimize the efficiency and speed of his conquests, the Macedonian emperor and king would again attempt to experiment with gunpowder, to use it as a formidable weapon against the Persians. But I seriously doubt that his short reign as the greatest conqueror at that time would allow for any innovations. After the collapse of his empire, gunpowder would again become a substance forgotten in the Hellenic world, deemed too dangerous for effective use in battles or wars. Later, after the Romans came to power in the Mediterranean, defeating their greatest rival at the time, Carthage, and in the same year in which they achieved final victory over their Phoenician opponents, they also conquered the Greeks. Hellenistic influence began to spread across the Roman world, bringing with it various knowledge that fostered innovations in all areas of Roman life, including gunpowder. While the Greeks, faced with the extreme danger of gunpowder, quickly abandoned attempts to find useful applications for it, the Romans would persistently seek its use until they employed this formidable substance in their conquests and wars. I have no doubt that during the experiments to adapt gunpowder for weapons, Roman masters and engineers would have faced countless deaths, significantly slowing down the innovations that could have been achieved through the adoption of gunpowder, due to the terror it caused to anyone foolish enough to work with it. But, as I said earlier, the Roman mentality is rooted in the desire for innovation and improvement of everything that can be used for its own interests. Regardless of the economic cost or human lives, once the Romans got their hands on gunpowder, they would not stop experimenting with it until they found the perfect application, ultimately leading to the creation of the first prototypes of firearms of that time. I think that only someone as brave as Julius Caesar could be the ideal person to first concretely test the effectiveness of primitive firearms in the conquest he was about to undertake in Gaul. At that point in history, one could confidently assume that after 200 years of experimenting with gunpowder, the Romans were capable of producing firearms at a technological level comparable to that of the Spaniards at the time of their discovery of America in our chronology. However, it is unlikely that by that time the production and manufacture of firearms had become sufficiently democratized to be widely adopted in the Roman army. Thus, Julius Caesar would likely use his growing wealth to gradually finance the production of primitive firearms during his campaign in Gaul. At the beginning of the conquest of Gaul, Julius Caesar's soldiers still mainly resembled classic Roman legionaries, just as in our timeline. But over time, with the increased production of firearms thanks to Caesar's personal financing, soldiers would gain easier access to these weapons, which would become a harsh advantage for the dictator's conquests. Nevertheless, I do not believe that the conquest of Gaul will take less time than in our chronology. It will probably still last about 8 years for the simple reason that even if Julius Caesar's soldiers have access to firearms, they will still need training in their use and maintenance. Moreover, Julius Caesar himself will have to adapt his military strategies and tactics for battles against the Gauls, using firearms, which ironically will sometimes complicate conquest more than in our timeline. Nevertheless, Julius Caesar's conquest of Gaul will be complete and absolute, even more so than in our timeline, as the psychological effect of firearms on the morale of the Gauls will be even more devastating for their defeat. But if I am describing Julius Caesar's conquest of Gaul in this chronology for so long, it is because I would like to mention another important point. Julius Caesar became the first Roman general to successfully conduct a military campaign using firearms, which clearly demonstrated their usefulness and effectiveness compared to more primitive weapons. It is also important to note that in this chronology, Julius Caesar's brief attempt to conquer Britain may prove successful. If you think about it, comparing to the Spanish colonizers of America in our chronology, one can see that firearms played a decisive role in their colonial success. In less than a year, the Spaniards managed to conquer a vast territory of the Incas with fewer than 500 men. Now imagine a legion of thousands of soldiers with firearms and cannons conquering territory that is tens of times smaller than that which the Spaniards conquered in our timeline. Simply put, it would be too effective. I don't want to claim that Caesar would conquer all of Britain up to the borders of Hadrian's Wall, but I am sure he could hold at least the southern coast of the island, requiring only a few hundred men to defend this region, thanks to firearms and cannons. After an even more successful campaign by Julius Caesar than in our reality, I don't think the rest of his rule would have changed much. With the capabilities he had in this context, the presence of firearms would have been merely an additional advantage in the civil war against Pompey, nothing more. However, it's amusing to imagine that in this alternate reality, if Julius Caesar had been killed, he could have been a victim of a gunshot wound rather than multiple knife stabs from the senators, becoming the first leader in history to be killed in such a way. In the future, I believe events would unfold similarly to our history, but with the addition of firearms and subsequent conflicts leading to a civil war between Octavian and Mark Antony, with Octavian still having every chance of victory. Now, with most of Julius Caesar's fortune inherited by Octavian, and with the majority of his veteran legionnaires loyal to Octavian, as well as experience in using firearms and cannons, I have no doubt that Octavian would continue to achieve victories in the long term against Mark Antony and Cleopatra in the East. Of course, Mark Antony also participated in Julius Caesar's campaigns in Gaul and Britain in this reality, and would be fully aware of the colossal potential of firearms, but he would have to start from scratch in the East. He would have to finance the production of weapons, train new masters, and then form new legions in the East, adapting their military style to the use of these very weapons. And this takes time. At a time when the legions of Octavian and Julius Caesar already had the necessary experience and knowledge for the production and use of firearms, which would make a possible, albeit not decisive victory, similar to that in our history when Octavian won the Civil War and ultimately reformed all Roman power, becoming the first emperor of the Roman Empire under the name Augustus. An interesting aspect of Augustus's rule in this reality would be the military reforms he could have implemented compared to our history. I think that in this alternative timeline, Augustus could significantly reform the army, managing to substantially reduce the number of soldiers in each Roman legion after the complete democratization of firearms. Perhaps instead of 5,000 or 6,000 people in the Roman legion, only 500 soldiers would be enough to form a significant military force capable of winning on the battlefield against Rome's enemies. It would have been significantly easier for the Romans to hold and conquer new territories, as they remained the only civilization in the world with the knowledge and technology to produce firearms. In this context, Augustus would have hesitated less about the excessive expansion of the empire than in our reality, and he would likely have been able to strengthen Julius Caesar's conquests in Britain, ultimately spreading influence across the entire territory of the island up to Caledonia. Firearms would become an unmatched factor in any conflict, regardless of the opponent's level of civilization compared to the Romans of that era. Furthermore, Augustus's reign was one of the longest in the history of the Roman Empire. During his reign, he would certainly continue to actively finance research on improving firearms and new types of gunpowder-based weaponry. By the end of Augustus's reign, weapons had become significantly more advanced than in Julius Caesar's time, providing better range and ease of maintenance and reloading. In this context, it is unlikely that the Romans would have been unable to conquer the Germanic tribes. Although the conquest would be difficult, firearms would fundamentally change the situation in such a conflict. In this alternate reality, the Romans would become an extremely respected and dangerous empire, capable of imposing much harsher conditions on their enemies than in our history. Given their knowledge of gunpowder, which was centuries ahead of other civilizations, including the Parthians, no one could replicate the advanced technology of firearms that the Romans possessed at that time. Given all this, it is not surprising that by the time Trajan ascended to power, in addition to all the conquests he had already made in our original history, he could also conquer and completely destroy the Parthian Empire, finally annihilating Persian civilization and returning these territories under Western control, which had not happened since the time of Alexander the Great. By that time, firearms technology would have significantly improved, likely reaching a level comparable to European weaponry before the 18th century Industrial Revolution, allowing the Romans to re-establish control over conquered territories and become the largest and most powerful empire in history at that time. However, even if the shortage of people was no longer a problem for the expansion and control over the territories of the empire, the logistics of managing such a gigantic empire would remain a serious challenge. There is also another consequence of the influence of the Roman world on peoples and civilizations. The problem is that after several decades or even centuries, as new territories were opened for the Roman world and its technologies, conquered peoples like the Persians could inevitably learn to use and minimally reproduce firearms to challenge the central authority of the Roman Empire. After the end of Pax Romana and the era of the 5 good emperors, considering all subsequent conflicts, the Romans would have to deal with several armed uprisings in various parts of this vast territory, leading to a much harsher and more destructive alternative crisis of the 3rd century. Imagine a catastrophe of almost global scale, akin to the crisis of the 3rd century, but with territory twice as large as in our history, and with super-modern firearms of that time, such as cannons and new weapon prototypes like bombs or grenades, that could create an unprecedented disaster in human history. The conflict could be compared in scale to World War I in terms of destruction and human losses. I cannot imagine how the Roman Empire in this alternate reality could survive after such a conflict, even if someone like Aurelian appeared to try to fix the situation.